Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone out to our fourth installation of the History Department and Phi Alpha Theta's Debates of the Dead. This year, yes, applause. Thank you. This year we commemorate the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, the end of World War I, celebrated in this country now as Veterans Day. To do so, we'll call forth from the dead 4 soldiers who participated in World War I. 4 professors from campus have volunteered to serve as their mortal vessels this day, using ancient Sumerian chants, unfortunate chickens and goats, pentagrams, and other things I cannot speak of. Earlier today, I called forth these 4 spirits, and they have now possessed the bodies of these 4 professors. The spirits have been observing things from the other side, and so they are aware of us and our situation. Let's learn from them. Let's call them out onto the stage. First, we have German Lieutenant Ernst Junge, housed in the body of Mark Choate from the History Department. Second, we have American Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young, housed in the body of Cameron McCoy, also from the History Department. Third, we have British Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, housed in the body today of Robert Means from the Harold B. Lee Library. Finally, we have Utah native Private Leonard Allred, housed in the body today of Albert Winkler, also from the Harold B. Lee Library. Before I begin my questions of the soldiers, Lieutenant Ernst Junge, who wrote a book on the war, has volunteered to provide a 5-minute review of World War I.
This is Europe in 1914. After the unification of the German Empire under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor, and Wilhelm I, the first Emperor of the Germans, Bismarck took part of France, Alsace and Lothringen, Alsace et Lorraine, and knew that France would be the enemy of Germany. So he founded the 3 Emperors League, the great powers, German Empire, Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also the Triple Alliance, the defensive alliance with Germany, Austria, and Italy. However, when Wilhelm I died, Wilhelm II fired Bismarck and broke it off with Russia. Too difficult to be friends with the Slavs and the Germans and Austro-Hungarians at the same time. And Germany estranged itself from Italy as well. This left one ally, Austria-Hungary. All these empires are worldwide. The French Empire here in blue, the British Empire in red, even the German Empire in green, and of course the Russian Empire and the American Empire. This comes to a head because Austria-Hungary, Germany's only ally, was weak. We're focusing on Sarajevo, annexed by Austria-Hungary, on the border of Serbia. Austria-Hungary was many different nationalities. It's a multinational empire. These are the different nationalities: Germans, Magyars, Hungarians, Bohemians, Moravians, Slovaks, Poles, South Slavs, even Italians. The threat was Serbia on the border wanted to take over all the South Slavs, and if all the nationalities went their own way, no more Austrian Empire. What happened was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian imperial throne, Franz Ferdinand, visited Sarajevo, right by Serbia, with his wife, and they're killed by terrorists. Gavrilo Princip, a university student much like you, who killed them because he wanted Serbian nationalism. Everyone's sad. Everyone's sad for Franz Ferdinand and his wife, murdered by terrorists. And this is, Austria-Hungary realizes, an opportunity. While everyone's sorry for Austria-Hungary, this is a chance to force the war with Serbia and take over Serbia and end this whole nationalism once and for all. Austria-Hungary speaks with Germany, and Germany says, do what you need to do. The blank check. Go for it. So a month after this terrible assassination, Austria-Hungary goes to war with Serbia. They give demands that Serbia cannot answer. And so Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. However, Serbia is backed by the Russian Empire. That's why Austria asked permission from Germany first. So this is the war. Austria-Hungary against Serbia, Russia against Austria-Hungary. Germany, though, had only one plan for the war, and this is to knock out France, because France had a defensive alliance with Russia. All these alliances were all defensive, but when Austria-Hungary goes first and declares an offensive war against Serbia, this starts all the dominoes falling. And so here in green, France and Russia, they're both in the war. So when Russia mobilizes against Austria-Hungary, Germany takes that as an excuse to declare war on Russia, and this brings France into the war. So these are all the great powers. And then to invade France, Germany has to go through Belgium. Sorry, Belgium. And this isn't a chance for England to come into the war to stop Germany from taking over all of Europe. So Russia and France, by the dual alliance, England through the Entente, the understanding that England did not want Germany to control all the world and take over the British colonies. And here in green, the neutral countries, the wallflowers, Switzerland, Spain, Netherlands, Scandinavia. But the war drags on, and more countries come in. Even though 1914 is a time of excitement, the initial plan to overrun Belgium skips the Netherlands, as we saw, and actually misses Paris. We almost won the war right away. We missed Paris, and then the different sides tried to outflank each other, this way, this way, this way, this way, all the way to the Channel, and this becomes the Western Front. The Eastern Front also is stagnant in 1914, and so that's why Italy comes into the war in 1915. Turkey comes into the war on our side, on Germany's side, October 1914. Greece, Bulgaria come into the war, each country with all of its colonies. So this is truly a world war started in Sarajevo. And the war lasts for 4 years until the United States comes in and wins the war, stopping the German victory, which was certain otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Junge. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to start with my first question. And I'll say right up front that I think the human toll of war, especially in this instance, in World War I, is possibly unspeakable. It's difficult for many audiences to understand what World War I was like. There are many popular movies about World War II and other wars. And while there are many movies about World War I, not many of them are well known. Yet here we are, 100 years from this great, terrible war. Can you each tell us something as we begin about your experience during the Great War? Lieutenant Owen, I understand that you wrote quite elegantly on your experiences. Would you share something of your experience during World War I?
Thank you. I'm a little disappointed with the body they've put me in. I don't see very well and I don't hear very well, but I'll do the best I can. You'd think after waiting 100 years you get something better than this. Let me just also mention that after languishing in hell for 100 years and watching American television as part of the punishment, as you can tell, I've lost my wonderful English accent, and I also almost lost my mind along with it. So I've written down a few things about myself, because it has been quite a while, and I hope you'll forgive me for reading this little biography. And I hope you'll also forgive me if my stutter comes out. But my nerves, I assure you, are in perfect order. I am a Shropshire lad, for those of you that are familiar with the poetry of A.E. Housman. I was born in England, March 18th, 1893, and from an early age I was dedicated to writing poetry and devoted to the great romantic poet John Keats. When the war began, I was in France, an English tutor to a prominent French family. I returned to England because there was no running away from the war. It was going to get you one way or the other. I enlisted in 1915 in the Artist Rifles and was commissioned a second lieutenant in 1916 into the Manchester Regiment. After serving on the Western Front from January to June of 1917, which service included suffering several artillery concussions and lying for some days next to the, shall we say, the scattered remnants of a well-liked fellow officer whom we called Cock Robin. Well, as I was saying, after a dose of that, I was not quite myself. I was diagnosed with shell shock and sent to Craig Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh for treatment. In a stroke of luck, it was at Craig Lockhart that I met the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who was labeled as also having shell shock, but who had really been sent there to keep him quiet while the authorities pondered what to do over his protest against the war. I was a great admirer of Sassoon, and when I showed him my own poems, he was very supportive and introduced me to other poets, including Robert Nichols and Robert Graves, and also gave me some connections to his own publishing contacts. Craig Lockhart was a productive time for me, and with Sassoon's encouragement, I wrote some of my best poetry, including Dulce et Decorum Est and Anthem for Doomed Youth. The season at Craig Lockhart also gave me the time to heal from my shell shock, and reinvigorated by a new sense of self as both a poet and a soldier, and feeling like my nerves were finally back in order, I returned to the front in September 1918, won the Military Cross in October, and then, so close to the end, I was leading my men across the Sambre-Ouise Canal on November 4th, just 1 week from the armistice, which we all knew was coming, and was killed by machine gun fire. The next day, I was promoted to full lieutenant. Thank you very much. Yeah. And continuing the irony, the news of my death reached my poor mother on November 11th, Armistice Day, as the church bells were ringing out in celebration. If I had stuffed all that tragedy into a poem, readers would have called me a maudlin, sentimental fool, but alas, that was my life. I was almost unknown when I was killed. I had only 5 poems published. Sassoon gathered and compiled the first volume of my poetry to be published. Thank you again, Siegfried. Now I have been dead for 100 years and 8 days, and I've come back in 2018 to discover that I'm now the most studied poet in England after Shakespeare.
Private Leonard Allred, would you share your experience?
I'm Leonard Allred. I'm from Wellington, Utah. I didn't want to serve in the war. For countries thousands of miles away, or to suffer over issues never properly explained, when all I could hope for was to return home alive and in one piece. The federal government couldn't get enough men to enlist over a few sunken vessels and the loss of a few score of lives, so they started the draft. This was contrary to the 13th Amendment, which states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States." The draft certainly was involuntary servitude. A World War I study stated that after 90 days of combat, 98% of the men became psychiatric casualties. I was in combat for over 90 days. We assaulted hill after hill. We took them because, well, the Germans were withdrawing at the time. We lost many men. And I don't think we accomplished anything that helped victory in the war. We lived in filth and stench with bugs and rats on the Meuse Argonne. We were all covered in body lice. Those bugs bit us and sucked our blood both day and night. We went for days without any sleep. And men fell asleep while standing up or while even on the march. Wounded men moaned, wept, and cried for their mothers. Sometimes we could help them. Other times we listened to those groans for days before the men died. I still hear their cries in my mind, even decades later. Once I held the hand of a friend of mine as he died. I don't even know if he knew I was there. But I tried anyway. I did awful things. I killed men trying to surrender. And I saw men crumple up in agony when I shot them. They say there were 3 ways to survive: sex, alcohol, and insanity. I did all 3. They said I had shell shock. I saw things that didn't exist, like a snake which crawled up my leg and then it disappeared. At night I saw a column of Germans approaching. I fired my rifle as fast as I could. In daylight I could find no footprints or evidence the Germans were ever there. In the 1990s, brain scans showed that men like me were missing part of their brains because their hippocampus had shrunk. I survived physically. Back in Wellington, Utah, I had a wife. I loved her dearly, but I abused and I beat her terribly. She finally tried to kill herself, and then she left me. They said I was a good man because I chopped wood for widows. I lived in a shack with holes in the walls. It has burned down a few times because I'm careless with fire. When I use the outhouse, I often leave the door open so anyone can see me. And I watch between my legs as the excrement comes out. Children come to make fun of me and harass me. I have a little red wagon. I pull it when I go downtown. When I do so, I walk in the middle of the street. I spent the last 10 or 15 years of my life in the Veterans Hospital in Salt Lake with other psychiatric cases.
Thank you, Private Allred. Lieutenant Colonel Young, would you share your experience?
Well, my experience started out centered on violence when it came to World War I. The nation wasn't even ready to have blacks serve, and we're on the defensive. This poor image of African Americans as disloyal, undisciplined, and wavering patriots is what shrouded everything that I ever did during this time of the war. However, A. Philip Randolph, our key spokesman during the time, said in The Messenger, "The Negro is probably the best and most loyal soldier in the United States. He does his duty in a fine, manly, courageous way, but the government has failed too often to do its duty by the Negro soldier." He continued, "Do not expect the supernatural from the Negro soldier. He has feelings, race pride, and ambitions like other men. If you prick him, he bleeds. If you tickle him, he laughs. In a few words, the Negro soldier is just human." And that's where I found myself. I was born just a few years after the end of the Civil War, 1868. Graduated from West Point in 1889. Was the third African American to do so. I led African American soldiers in the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiment, which is popularly known, at least with this what I've been told when I woke up, as the Buffalo Soldiers. Still trying to figure out what that means, where we got that from. I'll tell you. In the United States, Mexico, Cuba, and the Philippines. I was a combatant squadron commander for the 10th Cavalry Regiment during the Spanish-American War. I led a cavalry charge against Pancho Villa's forces in Mexico. I was blessed to be a professor of military science at Wilberforce University in Ohio. I was the first U.S. military attaché in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I was also a military attaché in Liberia. Unfortunately, toward the end of after the war ended, I died 4 years later, a disease that I acquired on active duty in Africa. So my time in preparing for World War I had violence on both sides, for me domestically and internationally. But yet I held strong to my beliefs in the country that I thought would provide the greatest amount of freedom. And I'd like to share a poem by Roscoe C. Jameson in 1917, the same year the United States entered the war. "Negro soldiers, these true are the brave, these men who cast aside old memories to walk the blood-stained pave of sacrifice, joining the solemn tide that moves away to suffer and to die for freedom when their own is yet denied. O pride, O prejudice, when thy passed by, hail them, the brave, for you now crucified. These truly are the free, these souls that grandly rise, above base dreams of vengeance for their wrongs, who march to war with visions in their eyes, of peace through brotherhood, lifting glad songs, aforetime while they front the firing line. Stand and behold, they take the field today, shedding their blood like him, now held divine, that those who mock might find a better way." Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Young. Lieutenant Junge, can you share some of your experiences?
I volunteered for the war. I did not like the bourgeois society of my father's home in Heidelberg. I volunteered and saw the war as a test of spirit and talent and skill. I was highly decorated in the war. I lived to the age of 102. I died in 1998. I saw much worse after the First World War, after the Great War. I never disassociated myself from my military service during the Great War. I was a writer, a philosopher, a scientist. In the trenches, I collected 142 beetles, a nearly comprehensive collection of the fauna in this genus in France. I saw the war as a test of spirit against material conditions. I was wounded 7 times during the war. 2 million of my countrymen from the German Empire died during the war. Between 9 and 11 million military dead died during the Great War. But I saw the war as a very meaningful pursuit, and I'm very sad we lost the war. It would have been better if the German Empire had won, especially considering what happened after. I would like to close with a verse from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 12, verse 24. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. Thank you.
Thank you, each soldier, for your experiences. Let me ask a second question. So many people before the World War broke out had been thought that Europe had been set up in such a way that this could not have happened. There were alliances, there was an entente, there was multiple treaties, and these were thought to have set up things in such a way that no one would start the dominoes to fall. So I guess my question is, do you think this is ironic? Do you have any thoughts about how we thought this wouldn't happen? Lieutenant Colonel Young, would you like to offer something?
Absolutely. How could there never be unrest? The Great War happened. Many men in power wanted it to happen. Again, violence. I go back to, I wake up in, what year is this, 2018? Okay. And we've observed from afar that political leanings have always pressured us to move in one direction or another. My people were used as an expedient for Abraham Lincoln in a war. Started over enslaved people. We see another war start, the Great War start, over the same reason, no representation. And not to hearken back to our forefathers, nor to create a new Boston Tea Party, but for us to assume that it could never happen again, or we couldn't believe this. I just look at my own backyard. I looked at Europe, and I looked at people who were suffering. I looked at my own people who were suffering, and I never saw any solutions. We never used our literature, our art, our sciences to come up with better ways to prevent this war. Today in 2018, it seems that way. Lieutenant Junger, he lived a long time, so he wasn't even buried that long. I think it's unfortunate the body he got, but
I wouldn't mind having that body.
but I think Europe was set up that way because there were dominant structures in place, power structures in place. And the United States happened to be one on the other side of the pond that was able to come in and to balance that. And I think the fighting was so bad because everyone did not want there to be a second war, that we were left with just the residual effects of it, that violence couldn't simply die with the stroke of a pen or a ceasefire in Europe or even in a hospital, but that it was bound to carry on.
Thank you very much.
May-
Anyone like to? Yeah.
Colonel Young, may I just echo what you've said? I was in France as a teacher before the war, and I felt like there was just so much pride and arrogance in the countries, and the alliances only made that worse. stronger, reinforced it. And as I wrote in a poem later on called the Parable of the Old Man and the Young, about Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, even though an angel from heaven called him and told him not to do that. Pride, I believe, was the cause. The angel says, "Behold, a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Sacrifice the ram of pride instead." But the old man would not so, and slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one.
May I jump in and say I would trade anybody's body for mine? I don't know what they were thinking in this case, man. I'm just some guy. I live in a small town. I don't even read much, but you know there's newspapers out there. And you know what we're seeing? This enormous military buildup everywhere. Europe is an armed camp. They can't even wait until boys turn 18 in Britain or 21 in France to teach them military prowess. They start the Boy Scouts just before the war to teach 12-year-old boys how to march, how to wear uniforms, how to swear allegiances, how to bivouac. 1/3 of the people in Britain, in London, live below the poverty line. They have no money to help these people, but they have an enormous amount of money for a huge navy. Housing in Germany is completely inadequate. A lot of people live in rooms with no windows. But they have money for this enormous military. It's hard for me to believe, reading in my newspapers in central Utah, to think that these people didn't know what they were doing and that they were just being nice about it. No, they were planning these wars. They were all ready to go. One of the theories on the start of the war was everybody was ready to go. You drop a hat, and within a matter of weeks, you have millions of men, fully armed, fully trained, marching to the fronts.
But Private Allred, what you described was denied to my people. I couldn't even be animated to join. I was held back. What you described happens in my backyard.
Yeah.
I couldn't even demonstrate my patriotism or loyalty. But here you have an opportunity, and
Which I
many
didn't
run
want.
away from,
I ran away from.
where my people just want to get citizenship.
I think you're too kind, Colonel, to the U.S. government. A few African Americans, as you mentioned, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, were allowed to function. They were small in number, but they were among the best units in the United States Army. And they were not allowed to be deployed in France because the white officers were afraid how good they were and how they would show up the white troops. So many of the best African American troops were patrolling the border with Mexico throughout the war and not allowed to show what they could do. You're absolutely right. What I assumed as a burden, you would assume is right.
Absolutely. And they didn't tell all the Italian girls and the French girls that you guys had tails, but they said we did.
Colonel Young, I wish that we could have had men like you in our outfit. We could have, we would have beaten the Germans long before we did. And Private Allred, I wish you could have been treated by Dr. Rivers at Craig Lockhart and spared the trauma that you suffered after the war.
This is the thing about war. There are two sides to a war. The problem with the war is you should have let us win the war. If Britain had stayed out of the war, if the United States had stayed out of the war, the German Empire would have won the war, and then the world would be much better. The liberals in England thought that war would never happen because it doesn't make sense, because it's a waste of money. But the Germans would fight for something bigger than money. The Germans would fight for the national ideal, for Kultur. The land of Goethe, Bach, Beethoven, Hegel, Kant, many others better than you, and you should have stayed out You should have stayed out and let us win the war, and then the world would be a better place.
But you denied Weltanschauung to everyone. You did not include everyone. You weren't inclusive.
This was a mistake that I realized decades later. But at the time, war is something bigger than ourselves. It's being part of something bigger than your own petty money-grubbing ways, and fighting for something grander than one person. But I'm telling you, if you'd stayed out of the war, we would have won the war.
Well, you were inclusive on everybody that mattered. It's the people that didn't matter where you were exclusive.
I'm a conservative. I support the German Empire. I'm not a socialist by any means. I'm not a National Socialist. I'm not a Democratic Socialist. But the situation in 1914, when everyone thought the war couldn't happen, this is much like the situation today in 2018, I think, 20 years after my death, when people think the war can never happen again because it doesn't make sense and who would do such a thing. But the countries, the armies, the passions, they're all still there. The passion to win and defeat the other side. It's still here.
I just wanted to mention that a young poet named Charles Sorley, who died in the Battle of Loos in September 1915, summed this all up in just 2 lines. He had studied in Germany before the war, and he wrote a sonnet called To Germany, and it begins with, "You are blind like us. Your hurt no man designed, and no man claimed the conquest of your land." And I really believe that in the beginning of the war, the idea that Germany was threatened was incorrect. That you were the threatening power, I'm afraid.
But there's so many Slavs. There's so many Slavs. And they rebuilt Russia after the Russo-Japanese War. The Slavic steamroller was a threat to our livelihood. The nationalism of the Serbs, the South Slavs, this is a threat to our ally. So we worried if we didn't do it in 1914, then we would miss our chance. 1915 would be too late. And this assassination was a unique opportunity. And if you let it go, then that could be the end.
Never miss your chance for a good war, to start a war.
It was a pretty good chance.
That's a good point for me to start my third question. And for this question, I'm going to embody myself, someone else, in this case, Doug Fabrizio from KUER. And so I'm going to ask this question in a style like him, because I like to troll people. So after avoiding the war for 3 years, President Woodrow Wilson argued that the United States needed to enter the fray to make the world safe for democracy. That's what he said. And some people associated his comments with H.G. Wells. That's the same author who wrote War of the Worlds, right? We all remember that. 3 years earlier, H.G. Wells had written first his articles in newspapers in London, and then compiled as a book that this war, and he's writing this just at the beginning of the war, remember. This war, the Great War, which it took 3 years for the U.S. to join, that this would be the war to end war. And by that he meant all war, of course. For H.G. Wells, it was German militarism, the sense of German military superiority, I think, that he thought must be stopped. Now, we all know that this war did not end all war, but did the war make the world safe for democracy like President Wilson promised it would? Can we give Wilson credit for his bold claims? I sense something from Herr Junger, and we'll get to him in a moment. You've been observing from the other side for some time now. Perhaps we could speak to Mr. Wilson's and Mr. Wells' claims. Do we still see things too simply today, or did these claims do damage? Or are they just propaganda? Lieutenant Junger, let's start with you, because you wrote about German militarism. Do you think that Wells was prescient in this way? I don't mean Prussian, I mean prescient.
Woodrow Wilson was from Virginia. He was on the losing side of the Civil War. He had the wrong ideas about the world. He was a history professor in the Ivory Tower. He did
Watch out
not
for history
understand.
professors.
He did not understand the real Europe, and he made a big mess of the post-war world, especially pulling the United States out after the Great War, leaving France, leaving Europe.
I think you've been saying Wells, but you mean Wilson.
No, I mean Wilson.
Yeah, Wilson. Yes, good. Okay.
As for Wells, good writer, and German militarism is misconstrued because democracy is weak, dangerous. Look at the election in the United States last week. No one even knows what's happened in Florida, the recount, Maya Love, and McAdams. No one knows. People stealing votes.
And a president who's trying to stop recounts.
Democracy is not a strong system. Many weaknesses, many weak points. To making the world safe for democracy, look what democracy did. 1919, leading straight into the Second World War. All those weak countries falling to national socialism. Travesty. I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not a national socialist. Hitler was a disaster for Germany, for all of Europe, and it's without the mess after the Great War, the way it ended and the way these weak democracies just all crumpled before National Socialism, it would not have happened. It would not have happened in my conservative world.
Hitler wouldn't have happened.
No.
Yeah,
Hitler
right.
would not have happened. Wilson making a mess, alienating the Italians, alienating his own Senate. What a disaster. The United States left us a disaster for Europe in the 20th century. So the whole basis for this idealistic cause, you need to make real decisions for real people in real countries, not just lines on a paper.
Well, is any world safe for democracy right now? What is this trolling you speak of? You know, there are trolls that run around now?
Yes, there actually are.
Okay, I need to watch out. But safe for democracy for who? The privilege, would it lead to an ending of all wars? If follow right up, on this one, I may have to side with Lieutenant Junger, that democracy did not save the United States from entering another horrific war. And let's look at Wilson just from one standpoint again. Yes, losing side of the Civil War. And also 1915 decides what he would do. Fire all African Americans from government service and not allow them to be in the government, U.S. government at all after 1915. So when you ask that question, Mr. Fabrizio, or is it Fabrizio?
Yeah, Fabrizio, thank you
Okay.
so much for remembering.
Was it propaganda? And I would ask that question as well. I know that he had some 14 points or something like that for some League of Nations. Where is it now? And what type of democracy would it provide? One for you to get the help you needed?
No, never happened.
Would your wife have liked that democracy in your own home? She would have.
Probably.
So I don't know. And if we still see it today, there's still contention. There's still political parties. There's still divisions within political parties. And I don't know if today a war would be the wisest choice. But if it is, I don't know what democracy it would be fighting for.
Wilson forgot too many things. He was too ignorant. He didn't know European systems. He's going to fight for democracy while denying women the right to vote in the United States. As Colonel Young pointed out, he's one of the most horrible bigots we've ever had in the presidency, denying rights to African Americans, forcing them out of government. In a broader sense, I think democracy is a good system, but I also think you ought to remember people like me. We forget the numbers. They become statistics. When the numbers become human beings, they mean something else. We don't talk about people like me. You're embarrassed by people like me. You lock me away. You don't look at what it does. We don't examine the battlefields Verdun, where you can go and look at all the tens of thousands of rotten bodies in the windows of the ossuary. If we would remember those kind of things, I think other things would fall into line. We would have to re-examine what we are as human beings, what we have as institutions, and try to look at the human factor of how awful and painful war is. If there was anything that come out of World War I, it was a hatred for war among many nations, and perhaps even more so in World War II. As volatile as the world is, as many problems as we still have, we haven't had a general war since 1945. We're living in the largest era of peace in the history of the world. And that's because we've learned to hate war and recognize it for what it is.
And Private Allred, I remember you earlier saying something about Wilson's attitude toward the end of the war that caused some military decisions in that very last week.
Very last day.
Very last day.
Let me talk.
On Armistice. Yeah, please share
Let me
that
tell you
with
about a friend of mine. You know, I'm from Utah. He's from Utah too. We've been on the other side for a while, so we've had enough conversations that I get a pretty good idea as to what he went through. I'm Edward Carl Peterson. I'm from Scipio, Utah. You might know it's a small town. It's on I-15. You might have even bought gas there on the way to St. George, or hopefully not to Las Vegas. I was drafted into the Army and sent to France, where I was wounded in battle. No one in my family or even the U.S. Army knew where I was at that time, but the French took me into a hospital where I recovered. I was then sent back to my Army unit. The officers asked me if I wanted to go back into battle. May God forgive me for the lie I told. I said I wanted to go back. I was very fortunate to be alive on the last day of the war, November 11th, 1918. At 5:45 a.m. that morning, the agreement between France and Germany was signed to end the fighting. They agreed that the fighting would end at 11 a.m. The news was sent to all the U.S. units. Then, in one of the biggest crimes in military history, more than half of the U.S. division commanders ordered their men to attack. This made no sense. The Germans had to withdraw from all of France and Belgium within 14 days. No matter what you take, you're going to get for free in a matter of hours. Any ground taken by the Americans on the last day would be handed to them in a few days. The men stood in disbelief when they were told to advance in the hours and minutes before 11 a.m. Americans were still advancing on German positions 2 minutes before 11 a.m. The last American died at 10:59 a.m., still advancing toward the Germans because he was under orders to do so. This was murder. More men died in the 5 hours between 11 a.m. than died in the 24 hours of D-Day in 1944. I was ordered to advance with everyone else. The Germans saw us and waited for us to go back. They didn't want to kill us, but they had no chance. They had no choice but fire on us. I was hit with some of the largest celebrations in human history broke out at the end of the war. I laid in mortal agony for hours until I died on the last day of the war, when the fighting should have ended hours before. My dear sister was so heartbroken that she wouldn't even talk about me. After she died many years later, the family found a few comments in her papers, including, "My dear brother, oh my dear brother." The U.S. government got so many complaints about men dying in the last day that they set up an official government investigation. Some testimony was taken, but the government soon stopped the investigations. They were going to make heroes of the U.S. Army leaders, and they didn't want the truth to hinder their efforts.
Thank you. Lieutenant Owen, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I wish I had my own words to fill that void, but I'm reminded of a poem by Wilfred Owen. By this terrible old body that I've been put into. By my good friend Siegfried Sassoon, who wrote a poem entitled "Suicide in the Trenches," about how a young man, a lover of life and youthful and sane and healthy like Private Allred, is broken down step by step by step by the shelling, by the lice, by just the incessant din and noise and filth and fatigue, until it's so bad that you have to take your own life, and that's what he does, and unfortunately. And Sassoon ends with a stanza that says, and it indicts really all of us, not just the civilians, but it also makes some of us who enjoyed the leadership perhaps and the camaraderie and all, and excuse the war for that reason. He says, "You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go."
Thank you, soldiers.
Wait.
Let's thank the soldiers for their participation in the debate today. I'd like to thank the professors for participating today, and on behalf of my own fellow friends still in the military, thanks for commemorating this Veterans Day together here. We hope you've enjoyed this fourth Debates of the Dead.
Hoorah.
Thank you.